Okay. Okay, so the class, yeah, the class today is actually about this. Basically, we're going to do causal link proof and plan space planning. So there is like we could check the correctness of a plan by progression or regression before. I'll talk about a different way, which is once I tell you, you will say that makes sense. Basically, you given a plan, you make sure that everything you wanted to achieve, somebody in the plan is supporting it. And between the guy who is supporting it and where it is needed, nobody comes and deletes. Okay. And if everything you ever needed has this kind of a causal support structure, then the plan is correct. That's a different way of checking the correctness of a plan. And as I mentioned from the beginning of the class, for every way in which you can verify the correctness, you invert it, you get a search. Do you see what I'm saying? So you could have a progression way of verifying, you invert it, you get the progression search. You can have a regression way of verifying it, you invert it, you get a regression search. You can have plan space way of a causal link, causal support way of verifying plans. You invert it, you get basically plan space or causal link plan, which is actually quite looks very much more complicated compared to the other ones, but it has many advantages. And in fact, one of the ideas essentially is, I would argue honestly that to the extent what you care about is the plan, you should search in the space of plans. Right? In regression and progression, what you really need is the plan. But what you're looking at is reaching some kind of a state. And then once you found the state, you remember the path. The path is the plan. Right? The path is the plan. So it's in the background. What you are looking at is going from state to state. If you are actually interested in looking in terms of if you're looking for plans, maybe you should be searching in the space of plans. Start with an outline, add stuff until it becomes a correct. That's pretty much what plan-based planning does. In reinforcement learning terminology, in MDP terminology, those of you may have heard about those things, that sort of corresponds to things like policy methods, things like policy gradient, policy iteration, etc. That's what it comes. So while we are talking about plan-based planning, essentially you can be thinking about that. One of the other advantages of plan-based planning, it turns out, is since basically you can actually look at the plan directly and then keep changing it until it becomes correct. So unlike in the progression and regression, this is the initial state, and then you finally reach the goal state. It's not enough to just say, I reached the goal state. You need to give the path. You understand what I'm saying? Did I mention my joke about, imagine you are asked to solve Rubik's Cube puzzles, right? I must have given that to you, right? Essentially, instead of solving it, I keep a bunch of already solved puzzles. As soon as you give me a bad Rubik's Cube, I'll say, okay, here, this is the correct one. Right? Do you understand what I'm saying? And so how the heck did you get it? Right? That doesn't help you. You need to actually need the moves that went to that state. Similarly, if in fact I'm solving the progression and regression using from I to G, and I say I reached the G, here is G. How do I know you actually reached it or not? You need to actually give me the path. Okay? These are path-dependent searches. One of the advantages of plan-space planning, we will see, is it can be just non-path dependent. If I give you the plan, You don't need to know how which action did I put into the plan first. If I give you the full plan, you can check if it's correct or not. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's an advantage. In fact, in thinking about search, you want to understand, where are you searching in a space where you're searching for the things that you're looking for. If you're looking for a policy, search in the space of policies. If you're looking for plan, search in the space of plans. Okay, and if you do that, path is no longer important. You see what I'm saying? And we will actually first show, and it turns out actually the interesting connection to this is if you took intro to AI, you would have heard of, these basically things like CSP problems. A version of the CSP problem is what's called 8-queen problem. An 8-queen problem is a particular kind of a CSP problem, which basically says, given a chessboard, put 8 queens on the board, such, and queens is, the 8 queens is the simplest, right? Given a chessboard, put 8 queens on the chessboard, such that no pair of queens are conflicted. Now, it's not that, no pair is conflict. The rules for, basically, queens conflict is they're in the same row, or same column, or same diagonal. Right? Now, one of the interesting things is that's a CSP problem. Right? If you say, can you place them, and I place them already, then it doesn't matter to you, because the actual thing about placing the queens on the board is not the actual problem. It is where are you placing? You understand what I'm saying? So 8-queen problems, in general, CSP problems allow for search directly in the space of the solution that you're looking for, rather than the path to the solution. And the advantage of that essentially is whenever you can do path independent search, if you can do path independent search, you can do local search. So there are like 2 types of searches. One is systematic search, where basically the usual A-star kind of search, where you start with like a beginning state, and then you consider all the states, and you consider all the states after that until there is some state, and then the path is the solution. That's the A-star search kind of a thing. The local search kind of a thing basically starts by saying, here is my plan. Is it correct? It's not correct. Let me put another action in it and see if it becomes correct. If not, let me put another, maybe I remove an action or change something, change the ordering to see if it becomes correct. So in fact, a quiz problem, you could solve it in both ways. You can start with an empty board and decide, let me see, where do I put the first queen? Imagine each queen is going to be in a different column, because that's a minimum, right? There are 8 queens, there'll be 8 columns. So you might solve it essentially by saying, okay, this is the first queen under the 8 positions for it. 8 positions, right? There are 8 queens, will have 8 positions. In that column, which row is it? Okay, and then if you decide that you will basically consider this, then from there you look for the second queen's position, etc. And if any given point of time 2 queens are conflicting, you backtrack until you find an actual full board. The interesting thing is, even though you search like this, the path as to when did you put what queen is not actually important from the point of view of the solution. You see what I'm saying? So unlike here, where you say I reached the goal, or unlike Rubik's Cube, you say here is the goal Rubik's Cube, it doesn't tell you whether I could solve it, because I need to tell you the actual steps I do. Whereas in these kinds of problems, essentially, it doesn't really matter how, in fact, if you basically tell me where each of the queens goes, I can put them in any order, like I put the 4th queen first, 7th queen next, and etc. It doesn't make any difference. You understand what I'm saying? So because of which, actually, a better way of solving 8 queens problem, from an intro to AI point of view, is as a local search or hill climbing search.
Yes.
Where you put 8 queens in 8 columns in arbitrary places, see if it's already correct. If it's correct, you're done. If not, you consider doing minor variations and see if you can get to a locally better position. And you hill climb your way. Hill climbing is nothing but what? is nothing but a discrete version of gradient search. Right? Hill climbing is nothing but discrete version of gradient search. In the continuous spaces, you could only really do these kinds of things. You are all very well, well versed in gradient search because that's what you heard in all the continuous function optimization. But that makes sense because ultimately, if I tell you what is the set of weights that has the optimal property for the network, you don't need to know which weight did I set. These are the set of.
You just need the weights.
Exactly. So the longer version of this, essentially, this is a background that allows you to say that if you're ultimately you want to do planning by searching in the space of plans. And if you do search in the space of plans, you could either do it in a systematic search way, which I will tell you, and a much simpler way, which is start with the plan, look to see if there are any problems with it. And basically, if there are problems, you consider some local modifications until you get over. You see what I'm saying? Okay. So that basically is sort of building up causal link planning before even get there. And then we'll talk about heuristics too. Okay. So coming back to the beginning of the class that I was going to say, so there was a little whatever survey of the course that was open for a day. That's what I said. And I think essentially 68% thought it was great. 11% thought it's too fast. 4% thought it was too slow. And 18% said sort of kind of okay, I guess maybe I don't know. I mean, these are the choices I gave, right? And then you pick one. And so presumably, essentially, I think 68% is a pretty good idea, pretty good number. Now, of course, there's a whole bunch of people who didn't take part in it, but hey, democracy is for the people who show up. Right? Screw the people who sit at home and hope for the better life. That's it. So I will do this, but and you get to give me comments. I don't care. You really tell me. In fact, one of the other things and so this was for last time, and apparently I'm doing better. 59, apparently more people voted. Maybe because of that, I was less popular that time. It was only 59% people thought great. Now I'm 68%, so I'm doing very well. So as far as I'm concerned, you want me to say that things aren't going well, this is your chance. I could avoid looking at you, but that's not my style. If you don't like it, let me know. But I understand that you stand up and say, Rav, I don't like what you're saying. You are worried about your grade, which is why I'm providing you anonymous feedback. Okay, opportunities. And there was, in addition to that, this is always open for the entire semester. These are some of the people's comments, essentially, except of course, this is checking the new form. I wrote that. Everything else basically is some of the people wrote. And basically, you can use it for any which way. It's only available for the class students. And of course, unless you put it like Twitter and people start putting random stuff there, it's only open for the class students. And I won't know your name. Okay, so you can use it constructively. And I already put, there's a TA hours as well as my office hours. And if you don't, it doesn't, my office hours don't work for you, you can send me an email and set up some other time or something. So next week, this is machine learning summer school in Melbourne. I mean, you do realize that it's summer in Australia. Of course, it's summer for us too, basically, we are right here and it's almost summer. So summer in Australia, so this is a machine learning summer school in Australia, and I am one of the people who is speaking in the machine learning summer school in Melbourne. And so my two lectures are on Tuesday and Wednesday. Tuesday is planning and reasoning in LLMs, and Wednesday is how do reasoning models, how do reasoning LLMs work. This is basically for people who are already doing research. The thing now, clearly, the right thing to do is to go to Melbourne. Melbourne is a beautiful place. Been there a couple of times, and some of the pictures I took last time around. Obviously, I am a loser, so I have decided I will do it. I mean, they are going to pay me to go, but then I miss teaching you apparently on Friday, and so I'm actually doing the lectures Monday, Tuesday, 3 to 4:30 p.m. here, which will be 9 a.m. in Melbourne next day. Remember, they're good hours. Right. So one of the reasons I'm bringing this up is I will record these and I will give those to you. It's basically so that, there are lots and lots of things I recorded, but this will be my most recent LLMs planning lectures that I'll be giving. The timing didn't work out, so I was originally thinking maybe I'll ask you guys to tune in when I'm doing it. In fact, I even considered doing it in like, get a classroom and do it in front of people. It's so much more fun doing it that way than to talk on Zoom. But I realized that pretty much other than these few hours, you are all spoken for. So I'll record this, and probably since I'll be missing one class at least, the week after that, I'm likely to go to make you watch those and then we'll discuss them. So that's the thing about LLM planning stuff. That basically I'm doing it. It's sort of a summer school lectures. Okay. That gets back to agenda for today. Are there any questions before I go forward? Yes. I don't yet know, honestly. Send me a message, and I'm definitely going to record, but I'm not doing the classroom. I did consider actually sending it to the PhD students in the department, but it's like a little bit of, I don't know, I'm interested and I need to find it in a classroom. So I'll just record it and then people will watch it later. That's more likely. I have a Zoom link, but I'm not really sure whether I'm supposed to give it out to people because if I have to go, I need a Zoom. Yeah. Okay, so that's that. Like I said, I may keep giving these talks all the time. So essentially, this is like the latest and greatest. So every time, in fact, one of the things I'm planning to do is last week, there's a bunch of things that came up on self-distillation, which has become like a new topic in reasoning models. And in fact, it turns out it's actually very well connected to this stuff on LLM modulo that I'll make you read because we have done that. And you can think of, in general reasoning models as doing LLM modulo, doing the post-training and compiling the results into the model. LLM modulo basically just thinks about the solution verification. And if you also do some kind of a process verification and say, instead of just saying this solution is right, wrong, you also say this is wrong because that would be like a full-on LLM modulo. And you take that and you basically compile that into the model. That will give you self-distillation areas. So this is the kind of thing I'll connect up. But hopefully some of this stuff, so there's stuff that I, research stuff, hopefully will become clearer to you. The advantage for you is that I can try to make you watch those at the time when you, at least according to me, should be ready because you have the background already. And then so, that will be very important. Okay, any other questions? Okay. So again, ignore the handwritten marks. Actually, that's basically I should remove them. But anyway, so we talked last time about progression integration and the search part of it. Right? Essentially, that from the search perspective, progression has a higher branching factor, and regression has a lower branching factor. But it could actually still be the case that in practice, regression can be taking more time in terms of search because in essence, it has these problems like these kinds of dead states that you can only recognize by doing reachability analysis. And reachability analysis, if you do it fully, that's as costly as planning. Okay, so that was something to keep in mind. That we did all that. Okay, so the other part is essentially there was a proof for causal proof and progression proof. And should I remove that line? It's okay, it's okay. Progression and regression proof, we already know. I want to think in terms of, I want to talk about the causal proof now. Okay, the basic idea is what I just said, which is you start, you have the initial state, you have the goal state, right? And you know that everything in the goal state, the things that in the goal state should be supported. Somebody should give it so that it will become true. Right? In regression, you almost do that, except you only think in terms of what is the last guy doing. But really, if I give you, let's say, a plan like load A, load B, for in A, in B is the goal. Then I would see, how do I check if this is the correct plan or not? One way of doing it is there somebody in this plan which is giving in A as its effect? Hey, load A gives in A. So I'll remember that, okay, there's a link. You call these causal links. It is causing that condition to be true. Okay, similarly, but the point is, and similarly, if in B, is there somebody in the plan that makes in B true? Well, load B does. Right? So I'll put a link from there. Now, it's not enough to make sure that there is somebody giving everything, that commitment essentially is not violated by anybody else. So one of the worries here is load A is giving in A to the goal state. In fact, it's useful to, in plan space planning, it is useful to think in terms of S0, which is the step 0. You no longer talk about actions, you talk about step 0, and S infinity, which is the very end step. And you can think of effect, initial state, to be the effects of S0. So for this particular problem, the initial state gave you at AE, at BE, and at RE. Those are the things it gave. This step. And then final step, whatever you want to achieve, think of them as the preconditions of the final step. Without loss of generality, right? Basically. So you could say the reason you need in A and B is this requires in A and this requires in B. And by convention, I'll try to write, in writing this, I'll write the preconditions in the bottom and the effects in the top. Okay. And in the very beginning, the null, basically, in fact, if you're doing search in the very beginning, all you know is S0 is before S infinity. Before, not immediately before. One very big point you want to understand in terms of partial order planning, plan space planning is precedence versus contiguity. Contiguity basically says A is right next to B. Nothing can come in between. A precedes B means A is currently coming before B, but it's a rubber band ordering. C can come in between A and B, and A will still be before B. It's not immediately before B, it's somewhere before. You understand? Precedence relations are like that. Okay? So, in fact, the way you construct this, you think of the plan as a full of precedence relations in the beginning, right now. And so I gave you this plan. And so basically, there is in A is supported by this guy, in B is supported by this guy. Now, of course, just like S infinity is a step, so are these steps. Load A and load B are also steps. So you need to make sure that what is required for load A is at BE and at RE. Right? Because if you're doing that step, that action, it better have its preconditions true before it gets done. You see what I'm saying? So one way of thinking about these kinds of things is S infinity really gives a fake effect called done, D for done. Okay? And if you D for done, the plan is correct. But for S infinity to say say done, it needs its preconditions. The preconditions are the problem's goals. For normal steps, this step will give you in B and at not at BE, but it requires at BE and at RE before it. Only if these are given will it do this. If they are not given, you can't actually execute that step. That basically means runtime error. You can't actually make the plan go. You guys see what I'm saying, right? And similarly, so it's recursively, not only do you need to support every top level goal, you need to support every action's preconditions. So really what we are saying for the plan to be correct is every precondition of every step, where one of the steps is S infinity. Okay? Every precondition of every one of the steps has a contributor. I mean, somebody is actually giving that condition as their effect. And between the contributor and where it's being consumed, nobody comes and kills it. If so, then you essentially gave a proof for every condition being supported without being violated. And if you take the conjunction of those proofs, that's the proof of correctness of the plan. Do you understand what I'm saying? If everybody's preconditions are supported and none of the supports are violated, then the plan is correct by definition.
So each so in short, each precondition needs to be supplied by someone else's action. And so
Yes.
long as you can show that causal link
Exactly.
between them.
Exactly. So to check that basically, and then notice that S0 is also a step. It is a dummy step, but it's also a step. So in fact, you can support some conditions from the initial step itself. Just like you here, so for example, this is being supported by this guy, this is being supported by this guy, right? But at BE is supported from the initial state itself. At RE is being supported from the initial state itself. But the initial state is just the initial step. You see what I'm saying? I mean, there's one of the beautiful things is that when you convert this into search, then this all become a question of how do I, put in things into the plan to make these supports happen. And you differentiate between what is called step addition. That means you add a new step corresponding to a new act, one of the library actions, and then say you do this. Or you can do simple establishment. Simple establishment essentially says, hey, you're already in the plan. You're not doing anything. You have this extra effect. I need that effect. You better be the guy who gives this up. If you do the step addition, then the new step came in. Now you have to sub-goal on the preconditions too. If it is simple establishment, in essence, that guy is there for some reason already. Could have been the initial state, in which case you don't even care, or could have been one of the steps that already existed in the plan. And so you don't need to do any extra work. You already, because that step is there, you're going to work on these preconditions. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the advantage of this thinking of plans this way is this locally, you look at each condition, whether it's satisfied or not. And I would argue that honestly, if I give you a big plan, the more natural way to check is this actually likely to work or not is, for example, all like the top level goals, is there things that is supporting it? Right? I mean, imagine I'm trying to go to Delhi, right? It turns out that I gave a whole plan and nothing seems to involve actually me landing in Delhi. Why waste your time doing the progression or regression? I'm not like landing in Delhi. You want to land in Delhi, there's nothing that's supporting landing in Delhi. You're already dead. You understand what I'm saying? So that's the way, in fact, not surprisingly, this is how you actually evaluate plans without realizing. I made up a whole bunch of terminology for it. In fact, it turns out causal link planning or plan space planning is a rich source of terminology. Okay, these are two names that you thought: step addition, simple establishment. Before you get done, you will also know promotion. You will also know demotion. You also will know confrontation. Unlike regression and progression, where there's like barely any new terminologies, right? All of these make sense. When they come to you, will realize step addition and simple establishment we already knew. Okay, this is when you can invert this, essentially. There was a question. Yeah.
So in this example, simple establishment, would it be that at B and at RE are given the beginning and that's what you used to?
No, so when you are checking, remember the point that I'm kind of doing this parallelly. If I just give a plan to show it is correct, I just need to construct one proof structure. And a proof structure involves, for every precondition, tell me a contributor and tell me between the contributor and where it is consumed, nobody is violating. Sometimes there might be multiple proof structures. Right? For example, just to give you an idea, since you feel a bit confused, let me give you a simple example like this. In G, I need E1, I need E1 and E2. Okay, and here's the plan. The step 1 and step 2 gives E2, and another plan, another step 1 gives step 1 gives E2, and step one, let's see what they want to say. Yeah, so step one gives, and then S2 requires J. Step one gives E1, E2, J. It's correct plan. Right? It's a correct plan. It's not that one. Because that guy needs J, somebody is giving the J. And every E1 is can be given, E1 is true, E2 is true. The question, of course, is who is actually giving E2? Who is actually giving E2? You could say this is giving E2, which is fine. Or you can say this is giving E2, which is also fine. There are two different proofs as to why it is correct. That's okay. Having one proof is enough. Yes.
For the example for the initial state at RE, are there two causal links to the same pole?
What?
Are there two causal links to the same pole
Where?
for at RE?
Yeah.
And then there's
The
two.
ATARI is giving two causal links to two different preconditions. Remember, the goals are position specific. That's the beauty of plan space planning. It's not like, it is not like I generated at RE and so it should be true everywhere. I need at RE at this place. Immediately before this action, at RE should be true. Immediately before this action, I also need at RE to be true. Those are two different things. By the way, the name for those, since we are into this, is open condition and unsafe link. This is the total of the terminology. I think there are no more new terminology, but these all just make sense. Okay. An open condition is a condition that needs to be true at a step, just before a step. And nobody raised their hand saying we are going to support. I mean, think of giving a party in your home. Okay, you need chips, you need dip, maybe you need beer, you need something else, and you're asking a bunch of bozos to come. Each of the bozos have to lift their hand and say, we will get this. And then make sure that, of course, after they said, then you have a contributor. Okay, somebody is getting chips. Tom is getting chips, and Mary is getting it. Right? So everything, at least there is support. Now, making sure that, it actually comes here, you also might know that Tom is traveling with Matt. Matt keeps eating chips on the way. And so chips are not going to make it home. So you need to remove Matt. Put him in a different place. You do this. I mean, you're laughing because you do this in life. This is essentially, so Tom giving chips to the party is the causal contributor. It's now an unsafe link because of the threat called Matt, who eats chips. Right? How do you make sure that Matt doesn't eat chips? You put the Matt guy before this interval. So put them in a different car, for example, so that they are not traveling with this car, for example. Or tell Matt the party is day after tomorrow. That's promotion and demotion. You see what I'm saying? All of this just makes sense. It's just that, it's like a bunch of things coming together and people get confused that, wow, why are there so many different things? But if you look at it this way, you're just basically checking whether each precondition has a contributor, and between the contributor and the supporter and the consumer, nobody is coming which can violate. That's how you prove. Right? So in this case, I would argue that this plan is correct because everybody's precondition has a supporter. And for every support condition, you can actually separately prove that it's not been violated. So for example, from here to here, there is a link. The only guy who can potentially come between here and here is this guy. And this guy is not saying anything about not in A. Are you okay? Yes.
So it's promoted. Just to clarify, unsafe link means that someone can come in between.
Exactly. Unsafe link means it's possible. Remember, the point, of course, about one of the interesting things with the Matt analogy is it is possible that that particular day Matt is fully overfull. He ate already chips before, so he's not going to eat chips in this car anymore. But it's a possibility you don't want to take into account. I mean, like, it's possible that if you have Matt will eat up chips. So you don't want to depend on the providence for chips to come. Right? And so you essentially take it into your hands. Making a plan is ensuring that it will be correct, irrespective of the ordering.
And promotion, demotion means like.
Promotion and demotion. Promotion is if there is a link like this, promotion means put the thread before the thing. Demotion means put afterwards. That's it. And since you said this, again, I'll say it. So if you have in some plan, at some level, you have S1 is giving P to S2, and there is an S3 which says, maybe I will delete P. In this case, it actually says, in fact, let me put it this way. S3 has a conditional effect. Conditional effect says J implies not P. Remember conditional effects?
Yeah.
It's the kind of math kind of a conditional effect. If I'm hungry, I'll eat up chips. Right? Okay. So J implies not P. That's a conditional effect. Now, this is a potential threat because you don't know if J is going to be true. And if J is going to be true, this guy is going to kill up the P. Right? So there are, for this unsafe link, if you are actually constructing the plan, the way you resolve this unsafe links flaw, by the way, unsafe links and open conditions are called flaws. So what's wrong with the plan? A plan is correct if it has no flaws. Right? And for each flaw, there should be a way to resolve the flaw. For open conditions, the way you resolve the flaw is step addition and simple establishment. And for unsafe link, it is promotion, demotion, and one other thing I will talk to you called confrontation. Okay. So the idea basically, so that's how all those names come, essentially. Okay. So if I have this, right, it's a likely danger. If you're planning, you don't say, I hope that card will make sure that you won't get killed. Right? You take it into your hands, you take the matters into your hand and make sure that you won't get killed. The way you can do it essentially is promotion, where you will say S1 will give speed to S2, but then S3 will be made to come before S1. Actually, I need to have a different thing because all of them look like links. So this a curvy line, let's call it, is the causal link, and whenever you have a dotted line, let's call it ordering, precedence link. So yeah, put S3 to precede S1. Or similarly, I can put S3 to follow S2. Follow S2. That's it. That's follow S2. Now, the problem, of course, is there is a possibility that actually this way it will make sure that the plan is going to be correct. And there is one more way, which is actually, this guy said, I will give not P if J is true before me. So you confront, you look at the bad guy in their eyes and say, oh, you want J to make not P, I will make not J true before you. You understand what I'm saying? So the third possibility is S1 is giving P to S2. S3 hangs around here saying if J is true, I'll give you not P, but now I will make J a precondition. It's an open condition. You understand what I'm saying? Now I'll make sure that will also happen. So in the case of Matt, I will say, okay, have somebody else take Matt to some cheapo restaurant and feed the guy so that he's full. Then he's not going to eat. That's part of the plan. You don't depend on Matt's goodness of heart of not eating chips. That's the whole point of planning. Planning is not leaving things to like the divine intervention. Right? You can always leave everything to divine intervention and say, this is the plan, God help me. No, then you don't need plans. Right? That's it. Those are the things. So now I kind of said two things at the same time. Given a plan, you know how to correct, check. And if I want to make it into a planning search, then I make that particular thing be the true incremental. So I start with, what would I start with? If I only have S0, S infinity, I will wind up having S0 and which will have all the initial state effects, and S infinity, which have all the top level goals. And then S0 before S infinity. That's the original plan. Right? And if it has no flaws, then you're done already. But unfortunately, here it has two flaws. In A and in B are two open conditions. So there are open condition flaws. And then you pick one of the flaws, resolve it, generate new partial plans, and so on and so on. That's it. Now, doing it looks a little painful. So basically, you think of a plan now as actions, orderings, links, open conditions, and unsafe links. Actually, the one thing I would say is that action is action steps. Because imagine there are only 3 actions, A1, A2, A3. But a plan can have multiple instances of A1, A2, A3. Suppose you can have A1 followed by A2, followed again by A1, followed by A3. These are 2 different steps, even though they correspond to the same action. So that's why we think in terms of the step terminology. Steps are mapped onto the library actions. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that's why you actually say a set of action steps in the plan, and each step corresponds to a unique action that you decided upfront. And an open condition basically says for a particular step, this condition must be true before that step. An unsafe link says, look, here is a commitment between this contributor step giving this condition to this other consumer step, which is one of its open conditions. And this other threatening step, which can potentially come in between. And what does potentially come in between mean? Because we are only throwing precedence relations, what you will eventually get is a plan with partial ordering. It's not necessarily totally ordered. It is certainly not contiguous. You see what I'm saying? By the way, this is real life. You are told, never are you told that you should take course 1 immediately that semester before course 2. Never. All they say is course 1 should be taken before course 2. So you can take course 1 in the first semester, course 2 before you graduate. That still satisfied the precedence relation. There are actually very, very few restrictions in general that course 1 and course 2 should be taken in consecutive semesters. In fact, in ASU, there is no such thing. But I can put those. That would be an interesting new kind of constraint. That is, I want to do intro to AI into part 1 and part 2, and I want you to do them in 2 consecutive semesters. That would be a contiguity constraint. Most of your course requirements are precedence constraints. You see what I'm saying? You can make a precedence constraint be satisfied by putting them contiguous. But you didn't have to do that. Do you understand? Okay, so anyway, so because it's only precedence relations right now, basically the plan is going to be a partial order. If you have a partial ordering, then the expectation is that you can execute that plan in any topological sort of that partial order. You know what topological sort? Right? If you have partial ordering, then you can see multiple total orderings that are consistent with the topological sort. I mean, that are consistent with the partial ordering, those are called the topological sorts. Any topological sort would be fine. One of the nice things is this kind of a planning, by the way, is typically has been called least commitment planning. It's overly So the idea would be, imagine you have S infinity, it needs E1, E2, E3, right? And imagine you have an action A1 which gives E1, an action A2 which gives E2, an action A3 which gives E3. And these actions don't have preconditions. Then, when I'm done, the plan would just look like this. Those are the causal links. That's the ordering. Sorry, this is the ordering. So that means all of these are before end. All of these are after the beginning. And each of them are supporting one another. The advantage of this is you realize that any permutation of those actions is a correct plan. Your progression and regression will pick particular permutations because it's just converting precedence into contiguity. So the least commitment part of this thing is least commitment to order planning. In fact, I would argue that much of the point about least commitment is to avoid commitment to various features of the plan. If you don't commit to the ordering, then you get partial order planning. Imagine the following thing. Imagine it turns out that I needed, at infinity, I needed effect E5. And it turns out that there is A1 which gives E5 and requires some preconditions, A2 which gives E5 and requires some other preconditions, A3 which gives E5 and requires some other preconditions. Right? What does this remind you? I need to be at the airport. I can take Uber, will get me to the airport. I can take Lyft, will get me to the airport. I can call a cab, will get me to the airport. I can beg and plead with my friends to stop going to the class and take me to the airport, will get me to the airport. The question is, should you commit to how you're going to the airport right away in the beginning? If you're thinking about like a big plan to go to, like Mars or something, why are you wasting time about, to go to Mars, then I have to go to Houston and then I have to get into the rocket and then go off to Mars. But then one of the steps, the very first step, is taking the, something to the airport. So I'm wasting time trying to figure out, should I take the Lyft, should I take Uber, etc., when actually the big ticket item is going to Mars. Nobody thinks about these low-level details in the beginning. The way you ignore low-level details is abstraction. Right? One way of abstraction in this case would be to say that there is a strange action called a airport drop. There's an action called there's an action called airport drop action. And it definitely gives you are at airport. And there are different ways you can do that. One of them is, so for example, for this particular thing, there is an action called giving E5 action. It definitely gives E5, but you can get E5 by doing A1 or A2 or A3. That's a choice. And I'll figure that choice out later. If I do that, I essentially did least commitment on the actions I'm going to put in the plan. Do you understand what I'm saying? So there are these connections between least commitment and abstraction. And partial order planning does least commitment on just the order. Hierarchical planning, on the other hand, does other kinds of planning, such as hierarchical planning, can do least commitment on even which steps are going to actually support what. So you will allow disjunction. In general, allowing disjunction is the way you can avoid doing commitment. Do you understand what I'm saying? Right? So that's what we're keeping in mind. So, but anyway, that is actually beyond partial order plan. This one is hierarchical plan. But think about just, you pick an action. That would be just normal partial order plan. There you are just avoiding commitment on the actual position. So this is least commitment to position plan. You realize that like, the difference between position and ordering are very different. If I give you like a bunch of actions that are, with the precedence relations, the specific positions of them correspond to a particular topological sort. You don't need to think in terms of positions, you need to first think in terms of orderings. And once you get the plan to be correct, then take any topological sort, that would be the solution. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, fine. So that's it. So you have, A, O, L, open conditions, unsafe links. And essentially at any given point of time, you have a partial plan. In the very beginning, the empty partial plan is S0, S infinity, with the open conditions being the top level goals. And then you need to remove the open condition, the F flaw, and then resolve it. If it is an open condition flaw, you can resolve it using simple establishment or step addition. And if it is an unsafe link flaw, and if you don't have conditional effects, then essentially you resolve it using promotion and demotion. But confrontation is required only if there are conditional effects. I wanted to also mention confrontation, but actually confrontation goes with conditional effects. And if there are conditional effects to be completely, I would also have to say that imagine in your chips analogy, it's Tom who is giving chips, right? Right? But Tom has a pretty bad car. And Tom says, I'll get chips as long as my car has gas. That day. Because there's no gas, basically his intentions, Tom's heart is in the right place, but he has no money. And so there's no gas. And so he's going to buy chips. So the conditional effect is Tom says, I'm surely getting you the chips if I have gas. In small print. That's a conditional effect. To make sure that the guy is forced to bring the chips, you need to give them gas. Here's some gas money, man, take it. And pour some gas so that you'll have enough gas to drive the car so that you can get chips. I understand chips and gas, it's a bad bargain, honestly. I mean, it should be a much bigger things. Like maybe you're bringing your kid from the school or something, that would be more useful thing. Because I will pay somebody gas cost just so that they can get their bag of chips. I understand that. But you see where I'm going with. Do you want to say? Right? So that equivalent to the confrontation, if you have S1, A1, which says if Q, then E1. And then I need some step requires E1. Then I can say this is the contributor. But then for this to be the contributor, I need to make Q to be an open condition before S1.
It's like a precondition.
These are called secondary preconditions. These are called secondary preconditions. In fact, that was true in the rocket example. Rocket, as I mentioned multiple times, rocket would go. The plane will go whether you're in the plane or not. Whether you will be in the destination depends on whether you are in the plane. That is a causation preconditions. And the confrontation is about what's called a preservation preconditions. I mean, it's huge amount of terminology, but the important thing is the intuition is very clear. If somebody is likely to give it, but they need something back in return, you will make that. Already they need their preconditions. But in addition, even this effect is conditional. So you make sure that the conditional part of the effect becomes an open condition. In addition to the preconditions that are already there before as well. Yes.
It's something that's not necessary. So for example, maybe Tom might need gas to get in, but maybe also Tom 2 might.
Tom what?
Tom 2 might also want gas to get in. Are these secondary preconditions?
No. Secondary in this particular case is a very specific meaning. A primary precondition is that without that precondition, that action cannot be done. Notice that the action is Tom driving to my home. And if the chips are inside the car, when Tom drives to my home, chips are at home. Right? And so driving to the home basically requires Tom is agreeing to actually do the car. Okay. But so in fact, I might actually, so the point about secondary preconditions is the action can be taken even if the secondary precondition is not satisfied. But if it has a certain desired effect that you're trying to use, and that for that, if it's a conditional effect, you want to make sure that the conditional effect actually happens. Okay, so once again, all I'm saying is that if you have S1, A1, and A1 already has, let's say, preconditions P1 and P2, and it has an effect E1 and S2 requires E1, you normally would have just put this thing, and then these would be the two open conditions that you need to work on. But had it been the case that it's not direct E1, but J implies E1, then you need to also put J. This action can be done as long as P1, P2 are satisfied, but it won't have E1 unless J is satisfied. Yes.
I thought we talked about how the conditions, like at least in the blockade example, like the conditional statements are equivalent to just like having 4 different actions.
Then you have to make them to 4 different actions. Then you need to, then it will just be, you're right. So if you compile the conditional effect into normal non-conditional effects, then you don't need confrontation. But you'll now have 4 actions to deal.
So it's just like too much.
It's just a different ways. In general, people have heard of conservation of energy. Computer scientists need to understand conservation of complexity. You can push the complexity into different bags. It's not going to go away. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is called conservation of complexity. And essentially, the question is the difference between doing it to 4 actions versus keeping 1 action and doing this confrontation is one of them might be better sometimes, one of them may be better some other time, but neither is definitely better than the other because they have the same worst case complexity, essentially. And this happens in search in general because you can push a lot of disjunction in the search space inside the search node. We'll talk about what that means. In some sense, that's what happens when you do abstraction. So there'll be fewer nodes, but then figuring out whether the node is actually correct or not, whether that corresponds to the solution becomes hard. So that's how conservation of complexity works. I mean, so to give a more vivid example that you will make sense of, you all are looking for boyfriends and girlfriends. And this is a very hard decision to make. There's so many options for some people. And you say so many, that could also be empty, as I said, right? And so you have a lot of options. Commitment is a bad word, at least for certain genders. So the question then would be, do I keep all the boyfriends and girlfriends in abeyance and keep taking care of them so that I have boyfriends and girlfriends, whatever, right? And that is actually a way of ensuring that you don't have to commit right away. But then at some point of time, you just have way too many of these things, and then you have to remember how many birthdays, how many cards, and you'll screw up and you'll do the wrong card to the wrong person and bigger problem. You understand what I'm saying? Right? In fact, one of the best reasons people say about honesty is the best policy is if you tell everybody a different story, you will finally forget who did you tell what story to. There are already too many facts in the world that you know of. F1 to F100, let's say. And there are like a zillion people. And if you are telling each of them a different variation of that fact, then you need to remember what did I tell to whom? That requires bigger and bigger brain. As I said, telling lies requires bigger and bigger brain and bigger, more and more process. So the idea is by not committing, you have everything available, but then it's also possible that if you actually, when you are ready, the people who think, I have lots of girlfriends or lots of boyfriends. When push comes to shove, they will say they also have lots of boyfriends and girlfriends. And so when push comes to shove, nobody is actually giving you a Valentine. And that could be pretty bad, depending on your life. You see what I'm saying? So in general, it's a question of where are you pushing the complexity to. Okay. Anyway, so that's your flaws, open conditional unsafe link. The solution is a partial plan with no remaining flaw is a solution. Okay. And every open condition must be satisfied by some action. And that action, if it is already present in the plan, it's called simple establishment. If you are putting a new action, that is called step addition. And every unsafe link essentially will be satisfied by either promotion or demotion for the normal. The tricky part, the frustrating part is when you remove an unsafe link, you remove the unsafe link, at least for the non-conditional effect. When you remove an open condition flaw, you generated new open condition flaws and also potentially new unsafe link flaws. You guys understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I have an already a partial plan, and this guy required which has a whole bunch of actions and the causal links already. Now I just need J to be true and this. There is this S, S15. I mean, there's an action which gives J. And so I put the action A, which will AJ, which will give J, as let's say step 15. And I'm very happy. But then AJ is high maintenance action. AJ requires 15 extra preconditions to be true before it can be done. So you now have 15 open conditions. Furthermore, AJ is a sociopath. Gets into trouble with everybody. So they also open up huge number of unsafe links. This is a whack-a-mole. Right? I'm trying to stop one open condition. I stop this open condition, 15 more open conditions, 17 more unsafe links. This is actually what is frustrating about planning. Because I already told you beforehand that the point about planning is you try to, you have a goal, you try to put an action to support that goal. That has preconditions. Now you have to work on them. That has preconditions. Now you have to work on them until everybody is happy. You're not done. So you need to get to that point where there are no flaws. Then, while you're doing this, these things are increasing when you're pushing it down. These things are increasing. The only way they increase is with the open conditions. Even in the open conditions, it's not the simple establishment, but the step addition. Step addition is a bad guy because that is bringing a potential new action into the plan. And that action can be both high maintenance in the sense they have a lot of preconditions and sociopath. That means they don't get along with anybody. They'll say delete this, delete this, delete this, delete this. So now you have to make sure that they are not getting into anybody's. Okay, so the notion of monotonicity, you'll say a particular quality is changing monotonically if it monotonically increases or monotonically decreases. The open condition, because of the open conditions, the number of flaws in partial order planning are non-monotonic. They reduce, increase, reduce, increase, reduce, increase until one particular point there is no flaw. Then you just call it a day and say, here's my plan. Let me go. You understand what I'm saying? That's the frustrating part of the search. Whether you do it systematically or whether you do it local search way, that's what happens. Right? Okay. So, yeah. So basically, this is the algorithm itself. Let P be an initial plan. Initial plan will look like S0 before S infinity, and the goal G1, G2 are the precondition of S infinity. And then flaw selection, choose a flaw. Currently, in the beginning, there are only open condition flaws. You have to pick one of them and work on it. After a while, it becomes both open conditions and unsafe links. You have to decide whether to pick an open condition flaw or unsafe link flaw, and if so, which one. You understand what I'm saying? And if it is an open condition, choose an action that achieves F. That actually has two choices: an action that exists already in the plan, so you co-opt it to support that condition, or you bring in a new guy who gives it. It's both have to be considered. You can't just assume that, oh, I already have initial state, it's giving the condition I want. So I don't need anybody else. Okay, imagine the following thing. Imagine the following thing. I have a block solve problem where in the end, A is on top of B is on top of C, and is empty. In the initial state, A is on table, B is on table, C is on table, and hand is empty. So the plan would basically, the initial plan will be this is S0, this is S infinity, and S infinity will have on AB, on BC, hand empty. Imagine I picked hand empty as the open condition first. Currently, this guy is already giving me hand empty. So I can just say, fine, that's definitely clearly that all I need is S0 gives hand empty. And you don't consider any other option. You're screwed. You see what I just screwed? Right? Because it is true that it's giving hand empty, but then pretty much everything you do changes hand empty. And all I need is in the end, hand empty should be true. This is true in real life. Right? So, in essence, what you basically have to do is not only consider this simple establishment, you should also consider every step that can give hand empty in a separate branch. Every step. And that's pretty much stack AB will give you a hand empty. Stack BC will give you a hand empty. Put down A will give you a hand empty. Put down B will give you a hand empty. All of them have to be considered. You can't rule any of them out. Because in the final plan, it may very well be that one of those guys are the ones that give the last hand. You guys see this? Where I'm going? So that's why it's very easy to assume that simple establishment step addition. I just assume simple establishment works. I won't even consider step addition. Search becomes incomplete. And similarly, promotion and demotion, you have to consider both of them. However, it looks like, in fact, to give you a sense of how this works, actually, the world's very first partial order planner is called NOAH, NOAH, which is actually like a descendant of strips. And it actually did two things at the same time. It did non-linear, basically it did partial order planning, it also did hierarchical planning together. It's like a mess of things, but it's like a big change from strips to that. And one thing that NOAA did is whenever there is, in fact, a threat, I'll just assume promotion will work. I'll just assume promotion will work. And it turns out that's incomplete. So somebody else gets to write a paper saying NOAA is incomplete. Right? So to put this in perspective, NOAA came in like 73, and the first clean version, and then after that, much later, like a bunch of time later, 77, a planner called non-lin came. NOAA is by this guy called Ernst Sasser-Wilke. And non-lin is by this guy called Askin. And both of these are actually both hierarchical and partial order plan. And for a while, these things are described so procedurally that it was hard to tell how to analyze these things. So people can write more and more papers saying this is incomplete. Exactly like LLMs. So when I'm in my element because I've seen this history happen in different times. Okay. So when the engineering is happening, you do engineering without caring about where it's correct or not. And somebody else has to come up and clean it. So these things were happening, and then people basically, in 1991, a planner called SNLP was developed, quote unquote, and it was by this guy called David McAllister, who was trying to teach planning in his graduate class at MIT. This wasn't even his area. Just like, when you teach, you want to make sure that you're clear. right? Unless you don't want to look at people and you just want to go on and talk to yourself, you want to actually kind of make sure that what you're teaching has sense. So he cleaned up. I wrote a much smaller paper called, this is what nonlinear planning, quote unquote, looks like, and he called it SNLP. It is systematic nonlinear planning. And that's basically causal link plan. It turns out that essentially nonlinear is already a very big step, and a small extra step is SNLP, and SNLP is approximately what I'm teaching. And weirdly enough, 20 years after 1991, basically McAllister got a classic paper award for cleaning up somebody else's misconceptions. I'm not making this up. Cleaning up people's misconceptions is science too. Right? So, then he disappeared. He didn't do any planning after that. Right? That was the only thing. And that was just, he was trying to explain it to students, and then he found it doesn't make any sense. These things they're confusing everything, and it. So that's approximately how you are pointing. Okay. Anyway, if you remind me, I'll send you that little paper. That's an extremely short paper. To send it to you. But that's pretty much what we are talking about. Okay. So open condition, you have to consider simple establishment and stack addition. Unsafe link, you have to consider growth, promotion, and demotion. And if you're doing an actual search, you have to have a branch of each other. If you're doing local search, then you pick a flaw, you pick a resolution, do it and see what happens. And then he'll climb you over. That's also possible. You see what I'm saying? Because once I have this representation, I can do the search to be systematic, where I start from the empty plan and continually add, or I can start with an arbitrary plan and see if it has already any flaws. If not, then I declare victory and go home. If not, pick a flaw, resolve it according to this. You have to consider one of these possibilities, way of resolving it. And then when you're considering different, then the interesting thing in the minimum in this kind of a thing is which flaw would you pick first, and which resolution would you pick first from a heuristic sense. And so you can do some look ahead search to see which one is looking good. This is sort of like gradient descent. Which direction would you want to go? And by the way, one very interesting thing is if you're doing a local search way, right, then you need like an almost complete plan. You might as well start. Why start from an empty plan if you're doing local search? So what you can do is you can ask your favorite LLM. Here's my domain. Here is my problem. Give me a plan, man. I will give a plan. If it is correct, that means it has no flaws, you say LLM gets 100%. If not, you start doing this change.
So
Our very original first idea, if you remember the paper that you read, we basically used LLM to generate a plan, partial plan, that is given to LPG. LPG is what? LPG is a specific implementation of a local search partial order planner. It's a causal link planner that does local search and causal link plans. So when you create a plan, it will then analyze it and see if there are any flaws, and then picks one of the flaws, tries to change it, and then recursively passes. So that's one way you can throw in an LLM if you are trying to put in a. But eventually, the correctness is ultimately coming from your theory of flaws. And the theory of flaws is coming from your theory of verifying the correctness of a plan with the causal links. So the difference between the LPG method and LLM modulo, which I mentioned there, but I will read it later again, is LLM modulo doesn't actually care about having another planner. It just asks LLM to, generate a solution and use a verifier to check if it's correct. If not, it say, this is the problems with the current plan. And then give me another plan, and you'll give some other plan and check if that's correct. This is generate test. That's LLM module. There you don't use an actual existing plan. Here I'm using LPG as an existing plan. So not using any existing planner is a lot more general because you don't depend on anybody having actually written a planner at all. Okay? Yeah.
How is it decided whether to promote or demote?
There's no, basically it's a search.
So both.
So here is the thing. So the best way to get intuitions about partial order planning is, believe it or not, how many of you know CSP problems, constraint satisfaction problems? You would have been taught if you took a reasonable intro to AI course. If you could mind, I would teach you that. If not, just go read up CSP part of the search chapters in stored trust. That's enough. And the funny thing is, the point of CSP, honestly, is the point of CSP is that it's a very simple abstract problem where, I mean, of course, as I told you, 8 queens is a CSP problem. Okay, so, but the best way to think about CSP itself, and the most abstract way to think about CSP itself, is that there are n variables. Okay. There are variables, n variables, V1 to Vn. Each of these variables have domains, D1, D2, etc., Dn. The domain is the place from which the variable takes values. The point of CSP is to find a valuation for each of these variables such that there are constraints, none of the constraints are violated. And the constraints typically are, one way of thinking about is allowed partial configurations. So for example, you might say if V1 ever takes a value 7, V7 can only take value 15 or 25. That's basically saying there's a constraints about what variables values, what values variables take. Now you can already see that the variables are the queens in the 8-queen problem. Values are the row numbers. Right? You could, for example, say that if queen 1 is in the row 1, queen 2 can't be in row 1 or row 2. That means it can be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So either you can write allowed partial configurations, which is one way, or an alternate way is no goods. That is disallowed partial configurations. You pick one, right? Either tell me what you're allowed to have, or you tell me what you're allowed not, what you are not allowed to have, whichever way you want to. So in the case of 8 queens, you can, it's actually easier to write no goods. So if the queen is in row I, queen I is in row I, let's say, then no queen, can be in row I or the column starting from. So those are the constraints you will. And yeah, diagonal, any sub-diagonal. By the way, graph coloring is another constraint satisfaction. Right, because you can put colors like the countries are the variables, the colors are the values, and the constraint is no two neighboring countries can have the same color, because otherwise you can't tell which is which. Although in the current terminology, actually we can put USA color on all the countries, and so it's a much faster graph coloring. That's a different story. Greenland is no longer green, but that's a different story. So the point being that graph coloring is a CSP problem. Right. Okay. So if you're doing CSP, normally what you do is you start essentially can either do it as a local search or a systematic search. And you would have to ask which variable to pick. If you're doing systematic search, which variable will I pick to give a value to, and which value will I give? There are many heuristics. like somebody was asking, how do you know promotion or demotion? Like the many heuristics, basically, if you have n flaws, which flaw will you pick first? First of all, you realize that if you think in terms of CSP and planning, flaws in planning are the variables in the CSP. Flaws in planning are the variables in CSP. Okay, just as every variable should have a value, every flaw should have a resolution. Right? So the question is, which flaw are you going to pick? Is like, which variable are you going to pick first? And there's usual ideas. For example, the joke that I do is like, if you're, at the time when I started this joke, this example, Bill Gates used to be a good guy. I guess the second branch of Epstein files haven't been yet released. So in those days, I would say, suppose you're trying to call, make a party where you're going to call me and Bill Gates to your home. Try to pick a day in which both of us are available. Now you need to consider there are various number of times when you can give the party. You need to call me and Bill Gates and say, are you available? Are you available? You don't know, like when you're trying to do like thesis defense, etc. This is a constraint satisfaction topic. Thesis defense setting 4 faculty members into the same room is semi-decided. It's actually most of the time undecidable. Right? They look like they're not doing anything most of the time, but getting them into 4 in the same room at the same time is impossible. Right? So the question then is, for a party, you need all of people inside. So the question is, if you're going to decide to call, you have to call Bill Gates and draw and say, are you available this day, etc. Right? Who are you going to call first? Who are you going to call first? And take it very carefully because I am teaching. The reality is you call Bill Gates because you realize that Rao has nothing to do. He's basically happy. He's like available most of the time. Right? So you call the most constrained variable first. Most constrained variable first. This is what I'm saying. Between Bill Gates and Rao, unfortunately, Bill Gates is more constrained. For mostly good reasons before, bad reasons now, but he's more constrained. Right? Now, having picked Bill Gates, then he says, so yeah, I'm available for the party on December 24th midnight and January 1st early morning and also like February 17th. Now you have to call Rao to see, Bozo, are you available on this particular? Right? I don't remember. I don't like the fact that you laugh, but I remember. So the point being then, which one are you going to ask me? December 24th? January 1st morning? Or some arbitrary April 17th? Whatever I said, February 17th. You will assume that even a Bozo like Rao, who seems to be mostly free, probably will be not free December 24th night and January 1st morning. But April 17th, February 17th, just a normal day. So you pick the least constraining value. You pick the most constrained variable first and the least constraining value of that variable in the search. This is the first idea of heuristic first yes. If you were to do this for planning, for any given flaw, you need to see the one that has fewest possible ways to resolve. That will be the most constrained flaw. For example. You see what I'm saying? And that's a heuristic. People actually use that kind of heuristic. The only difference between planning and the normal CSP from the context, planning and normal CSP from the context of CSP is the number of variables in CSP are predefined. N variables. But number of flaws is dynamically increasing. Remember I said that the moment you pick an open condition and support it with this antisocial high maintenance action, you suddenly have more open conditions and more unsafe links. That is like saying that I have this magical chessboard where if you put, in the beginning I'll just say just have to put 8 pins in the right place. But then I will say, and there's a whole bunch, basically the chessboard kind of looks, imagine that the chessboard kind of looks like this, but unbeknownst to you, it can get that big. Upfront, it looks like I'm just asking you, just like the planning says, just make G1, G2, 2, you're done. Similarly, it says just put these 8 queens in the place and you're done. But then imagine it turns out that if I put, oh, by the way, and then I say, okay, let me just put queen 1 in this position, queen 1 in the, let's say, 4th row. Then I say, oh, I forgot to tell you, if queen 1 is in the 4th row, then these extra columns open up. It turns out that you need to also place queen 17 and queen 19. This is a weirdo chessboard. That's what planning is. You understand what I'm saying? The moment I made a precondition be supported by a step that has extra 15 preconditions, all of a sudden, you open up new flaws. So this is basically what is called dynamic constraint satisfaction problem. Where some number of variables like these are sleeper variables. These are sleeper columns. They were not there before. Right? But the moment I get a certain thing done, some sleeper cells wake up. The reason I'm doing this, first of all, this is a graduate. You guys should understand connections between things. I can just teach the plan space planning algorithm as if nothing else in the world existed. I can do that. It's not that hard. But the point is, it's much more interesting to see how things are connected. And when else will you do it? I mean, this is probably one of few courses. After this, you'll drop out of the program anyway. So probably you want to understand how things are connected. You see what I'm saying? So that's basically the plan space planning. There is an example, for example. This one, actually, I mean, if you want, after I come back, I can walk you through this, but it's a very simple example of shall I do this example first? I'll take a break and you will do this example once, just to say that I've shown one path through plan space planning. Okay, you can take a 15-minute break and come back. I'll do this and then I'll do the heuristics. But basically, this is the one that we'll look at. It's a very simple thing. I give I before G, and G requires Q at G and P at G, G being S infinity. And the problem is there are two actions. These are these two dummy actions for Q. We'll do that and we'll get into that. Okay. Which one? That one? And which one it is? Okay. Okay, so all I'm going to do now is just do that one step by step, just once, so that you see it. And remember, tracing a search involves not showing the entire branching factor because there's not enough large enough board, but showing that there are some choices that will lead to a solution. In this case, I will just do the right choices. Your normal search algorithm has to pluck up until it knows it. Okay. So basically, I have S0 followed by S infinity, and S infinity has Q and P. I'm just doing this right there, again, Q and P. And goals are P and Q. And so the actions I have in my library, I have action A1, which takes M and gives P and not N. Okay, and then similarly, A2 takes N and gives Q. Right? And basically, initial state happens to have M and N. That's it. Right? So the plan that you start with will be this plan. And so it has two flaws, Q at S infinity and P at S infinity. Right? And I'm going to do it the same way there. So I'll pick Q at S infinity. I said it G, but I'm calling it S infinity. So I pick this guy. And to do Q at S infinity, I should consider simple establishment and step addition. Simple establishment means there should be some step here that already has Q as its effect. There is no such step. Step addition means there should be some effect that gives Q that I want to wholesale import it. Right? Now, it turns out there's only one such step because A2 is the only step. Right? So I would then basically say S0 followed by S1 will be A2, right? S1 will be A2. Of course, it has to come before S infinity. It still requires P at S infinity, and the Q at S infinity is being given by this guy. I have to again remember to say that the ordering relations really, I'm going to just to be on the safe side, I'm going to draw them in. That's the convention. Ordering relations will be like in the thing, and the causal link here is this. Right? And now, of course, because I have A2, it has now N at S1 as a new flaw. And let us find a new flaw. Okay. At this point, I now have essentially I have to consider all the flaws, and there are P at S infinity is one of the flaws because it's not supported, and at S1 is also one of the flaws that's not supported. There are no unsafe links as of now because the only link that exists is going from A2 to support this. And there's nothing in between S1 and S infinity, so it can't kill Q. Right, okay. So then basically I get to either pick P at S infinity or N at S1. Imagine I've decided to pick P at S infinity. I just want to show one, right? I'm doing more of a systematic search. Okay, P at S infinity. At this point, I have my old plan. And then for P at S infinity, I need to look for somebody who gives P. Right? There is no simple establishment possibility. Right? Because S0 only gives plus M and plus N. I'm copying, it's painful to copy, but in the computer, it's essentially, it's like this, the plan constraint. Plan is a set of constraints, and you're just copying the constraint set and adding new constraints. By the way, this is also called refinement planning because in the refinement planning, you only add constraints, you never remove constraints. Right? Okay. And then we can actually talk about the semantics of adding constraints later on. But so anyway, so in this particular case, only A1 has to be put in, right? So then I have to S2 A1, and that does have P and M. And I can make PB supported here. And then actually I should probably use a different color for the orderings just so that you can make sense of them. So imagine the ordering for green. Okay, that's the orderings. And so this one, what about this guy's orderings? This ordering will be like this too. Because as of now, all you need is S2 is giving something to S infinity. It needs to come before S infinity. That's the only requirement. Causality doesn't progress backward. It only progresses forward in the time, right? So S infinity, basically S2 has to come before S infinity. And of course, nothing can come before the plan, right? And so it has come to after S0. Okay, any additional orderings we haven't yet. Okay, now you have two causal links and one open condition still. And okay, by the way, A1 requires M. A1 requires M. And this one is still there, M at S1 and M at S2. Notice how it's painfully kind of, it's an obvious thing. You can see what the plan is, but I'm just doing how to do it step by step in terms of picking everybody and supporting conditions, right? So you need to either pick one of the unsafe links or one of the open conditions, if there are any unsafe links. Okay. So at this point, yet, as far as I can tell, is there any unsafe link? So notice that, so think about this. So this is supporting Q, this is supporting P. So that is the same picture being shown here. This is supporting Q, this is supporting P. Right? But one, then let's see. Yeah, so there is a not N that A1 takes M and gives P and not N. Yeah, this is not N. So nobody is actually killing P or Q. So there is still no problem. Right now, there are no unsafe links. You can see that. Right? I mean, it's painful for you to see, but I mean, it's very easy to write a code, checks for every causal link, check if there is a potentially, a step that can come between possibly, and if it has a negative other condition. That's okay. So then now I then essentially, just to make it more interesting, then I will take the N at S1. The reason I'm kind of picking it is I could have picked the other one too, but I pick N at S1 because N is the one thing that actually has a threat. Right? So I'll see if they'll get me an unsafe link also into the exam. So to get N at S1, here I will just say I will take I and support A2. So I'll copy the whole thing again, and then I'll support I in, the initial state has N true, right? So simple establishment, there's no step addition. In fact, there's no step addition possibilities anyway, because none of the two actions are giving N. So I will decide to do simple establishment. When I do simple establishment, already I is coming necessarily before it. By the way, in a partial ordering, there is this notion of necessarily before and possibly before. You can say A is necessarily before B if there is an actual link saying, ordering saying A must come before B somewhere, not contiguous, just before B. But A can still possibly come before B if in fact you have something like A here, B here, and this is infinity. So A and B currently are parallel, but in the execution you might do A before B or B before A. That's called possibility. Threats are all about possibilities. If it is a necessary threat, there is very little you can do. If it is a necessary threat, you can't promote or demote. You can only confront, if it is possible. If you understand what I'm saying. Right? So if it is so basically, in this case, after you get here, you will realize that this link, I giving N to A2, is potentially threatened by A1 coming between I and A2. Because A2, A1, because A1 has the negative N, delete N as its effect. This is what I'm saying. So you can get it basically right now, it is possibly can come in between. So that's an unsafe link. You see this. Finally, you saw one example of unsafe. And at this point, I decided to resolve the unsafe link. I can resolve the unsafe link by taking the thread, putting it before I or after A2. But putting it before I doesn't make sense because nothing can come before the beginning of the plan. So it has to only come after A2. So I actually put a link, an ordering from A2 to A1. So the difference between this and that is here, curvy lines are the causal links and straight lines are the ordering arrows. So now you have a partial plan saying I followed by A2, followed by A1, followed by G. Because if you do the for topological sort, really, even though A2 is before G, but A2 is also before A1, which is before G, which means A2 is actually before A1, which is before G. That is that's the topological sort. Right? So at this point, everything is taken care of except M at S2. That's the one thing that's left. You can establish M at A1, basically. A1 is the step S2, right? And it turns out that M is present in the initial state. So I will put a link from I to A1 and I'm done. At that point, there are 0 flaws, no unsafe links, no open conditions. So for this simple problem, you are done. You see what I'm saying? So if you see it as just repetitive application of the simple idea, finding flaws and resolving, it's easy. If you see it in terms of, oh my God, so many steps, it looks so much better to do progression regression, then it looks hard. But you can see why it's advantageous, because this way, in fact, even though I did these flaw selection one step by another step, I could potentially have guessed a plan, check the flaws, see if the flaws are 0, that is empty set. If not, pick a flaw, resolve it, one way of resolving it, and see if in fact that somehow magically improves everything. That would be local search. And picking which flaw and which resolution can be done in the hill climbing. Basically, which one will wind up reducing the flaws the most, for example. That's what LPG does. Yes.
You mentioned when we went to this first step, when we went for, like, was the first step S1A2, added N and we got Q. Why is N a flaw?
What?
Why does N become a flaw there?
Because N has to be made true before A2. It is a flaw until somebody commits to making N true. That's the idea. The idea is, you know what your needs are. The conditions are your needs. And your needs are met if a supplier says, I will get you that. And between the supplier and you, nobody violates it. Until then, it's not satisfied.
Don't we start with N then?
What?
Don't we start with N?
We never started with N, right? In this picture, I didn't start with N. It is, so one of the weird things is, you could actually say this is a very complex way to do something simple. In fact, if you were to do progression and regression here, it's much faster. That's why nobody likes fast error planning. But it has many advantages, including the fact that actually understanding things like policy gradient or doing local search on plans involves starting from the plan and changing it. You see what I'm saying? It has the cleanest connection to planning as a constraint satisfaction problem. Yes.
I have a question. Why is there a path from I to A1 to G?
What?
I to A1 to G?
I to A1 to G. No, this is I always comes before A1, and A1 has to come before G because something that see everything has to come before after I. When A2 was put in originally, it was put in to support something at G. So it needs to have an ordering with G. And everything in the plan has to come after I. So it must have an ordering with I. In fact, that's basically it. So when you introduce a step, the step has to come between wherever the need is and the beginning of it. What else will you do? Yes.
So when the simple establishment happened from I to A2, like I understand, like, just looking like with the bird's eye view that this creates an unsafe link, but like algorithmically, like what calculation happened to determine that there was an unsafe link?
No, that's very simple, right? Basically, the idea is again to see the unsafe link. For each link, you already know the links, right? For each link, there is a source and a destination. You can consider every step that can come between source and destination. That is just a simple call on the partial order. All the steps that can possibly come in between. And if any of them have a negation of this condition, then it's a possible threat.
Oh, since A1 and A2 are the possibly before scenario, if A1, like since A1 could come before.
Exactly, because they were currently parallel.
Yeah, okay.
So this is the interesting part about least commitment. The idea is you may have looked at this problem and with a reasonable amount of thinking, just a couple of steps of thinking, you will realize that eventually A2 has to come before A1. Right? But the planning is actually getting you to do that. If you do progression, you could have considered either A2, beginning with A2 or beginning with A1. And one has to fail before you try the other one. That is the least commitment you're doing here. You are not considering the ordering at all. I mean, you're allowing for positions to be not fixed. And the positions can be relatively rearranged so that there is no failure.
And we didn't have to check G because that's a necessarily after.
Exactly.
A2 is necessarily. Thank you.
Okay. So interestingly, actually, I mean, there's a whole amount of history on this, but I think we can, I mean, I'll send you probably a tutorial on partial order planning that you can also read. Basically, that basically gets through this whole setup. There's a paper by Daniel in the AI magazine. I sent it to you. It's an older paper. And it actually does both normal SNLP as well as the UCP. But the SNLP is the first thing, but then Daniel wrote a bigger thing. But you can just read as much as you want, because if you understood this, then you pretty much understood what I want you to do. Okay. Every part where in this class you can dig deeper. And it's just okay. So that's about partial order planning. That's called, it has many names. It's called causal link planning. It's called partial order planning. It's called least commitment planning. Here it's least commitment to position. Yes.
Is the final mapping of all of the states the plan space that we went through a question for on the homework you released yesterday?
What I'm saying now.
So is that the plan space or like?
So there was like, I asked you to do register swapping problem, which is actually, by the way, an interesting problem. It turns out it is sort of like Sussman anomaly, but it's actually non-ergodic, because you can overwrite registers. I'm not giving away anything if I tell you that once you overwrite a register, the value on it is lost forever. Right? Yeah. After you overwrite, you can't say, what did I overwrite on? Right, for example. So that's unlike Sussman anomaly, which is actually ergodic, right? Register swapping is actually non-ergodic too. Okay. But anyway, I asked you to do register swapping with progression, with regression, and with also causal link.
Okay.
That's why I wanted to do this, so that you are now ready for that homework.
Awesome.
All three examples, and all three things you can trace. Yes.
As A1 is the unsafe link, is it promotion or demotion that we put it after A2?
Which one?
A1.
The unsafe link is not A1. The unsafe link is actually I giving N to A2 and A1 being the threat. And what did you do? You put A1 after, so A1 basically you put it after A2. That is demotion. Promotion means putting it earlier, and demotion is later. I mean, the names are kind of less important. I mean, it's nice, colorful names, but promotion and demotion are. Yeah. But really, all you're changing it up. Right? Okay, so that's basically plan space planning. Any other questions on this? Yes.
So if A1 was not a threat, then we would have just left it like that and we could have done either order, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty much. By the way, this is just a single. So the problem about tracing a search algorithm is nobody asks you to draw the entire search by hand. Right? You just show one trace that goes. That's true for progression and regression too. Normally what you do is you maybe show other things at every point, what other choices were there, and you consider the choice that should be, just like I spoke here. But you just show one thing that goes all the way to the end, just to see that you understand. Of course, an algorithm needs to consider all the choices, put them on some open list, and then pick from between them. I can do an entire semester of stuff on just partial order plan. And in fact, for a while, this is the interesting thing, for a while, actually, all of planning would be about just partial order and how to do these algorithms more and more efficient. But it turns out now that's sort of fallen by the wayside, not because we, sometimes the relative importance of problems changes because other things come up. Okay, so I think right now plan space planning is interesting mostly because it makes you think about doing basically local search on plans. You can start directly with the plan and do local search. And also, it's other very important thing that I really want you to kind of understand. Yeah. Anyway, there's additional stuff here. What did I say here? Yeah. So the notion, the progression corresponds to actual world states. The state. So in general, in search, the state of the search is different from the state of the world. In progression, search state is the world state. If you have a, in fact, one of the things that people like about progression is you have the part of the plan that's ready that you can start executing. But you don't know that the plan is actually going to be the part of the final plan. In which case, if you execute, it's not that you get any points, right? Because if you executed like, a prefix, that's not a prefix of the final solution, then you're screwed. In the case of regression, there is no such temptation because you only told the last actions, the suffix of the plan. So there is nothing like, can I execute? Of course you can't execute because you don't have, execution is done in the, from the initial state forward. Okay, many people tend to confuse the fact that progression allows you to do partial execution to mean that somehow progression is better. No, it's not better. It is that you're taking a chance just because you have some actions that are part of the prefix. It's not like you have ensured that this prefix can actually become a final solution. Pretty much the only place where any prefix can be part of a valid, if inoptimal solution is ergodic domains. Just like in this class, when I make a meaningful pause, say ergodic and you'll be right. Right. Because pretty much anything you do, you can undo it. And so people, this is the problem, right? Basically, like you're trying to think of the solution and your boss says, tell me a few things. What is the point telling you a few things unless I know the full solution? But everybody wants partial progress. Right? So you need to do some window washing. Right? Essentially, so that they think that this is why I say that illusion of progress is more important than progress itself in our bureaucracies. Right? For example, like if somebody is trying to prove P equal to NP, right? You can't ask them, can you give me a weekly report as to how far have you come? What the heck is the point of that? But that's what we do because we need some kind of a way of judging the progress, quote unquote. And since in the progression, it looks like you can at least execute the prefix, you feel as if that's a better idea, but it's not. It actually depends on whether the thing is ergodic or not. Okay? And in the case of regression, of course, that temptation goes away. In the case of plan space, also that temptation goes away. But you could do the following thing. If you could do progression, you can say, if you're suddenly somewhere around this area, right? And people say, please execute something. Boss is waiting for you to execute something. Right? The regression wala doesn't know what to do. Regression guy doesn't know what to do because they only have the suffix. But here, you can figure out what is the possible things that can be done after initial state. It turns out right now either this or this can be done. So just do one of them and Hail Mary. Right? If you're wrong, then you have to redo stuff. You see what I'm saying? So if all you care about is execution, you could do plan space planning and you can take essentially the initial fringe of all the actions that can happen right after the initial state. That can possibly happen right after the initial state and do one of them and say, I made it for you. But of course, when you do that, you actually have made a commitment. That action is now being done. So essentially, you need to change the plan such that it corresponds to the new initial state. And that's what you do in the progression also. And the reason I'm bringing this up is basically because people think progression can interleave planning and execution. Regression doesn't. Regression actually doesn't, but plan space planning maybe doesn't. Interleaving planning and execution can be done. Basically the problem about interleaving, first of all, is that you can only interleave if you know that you don't have to back. Because backtracking in the real world may not be actually possible. Backtracking in the mental space, simple. Search is mental. Backtrack in the real world, if the action, like for example, you first bomb, right, then you can't undo it. That's the whole thing, right? You can't shoot first and ask questions later. The whole point of that is because after shooting first, you can't ask questions. You can't undo the shooting either. So you ask all the questions and then shoot. If you want to shoot. Right? At least even your goals are not satisfied. If you needed some secrets from the guy and you want to, and then after that you want to kill. So kill the person, get the secrets. First killing them doesn't get you any secrets. Because it's not a good word. After killing a dead man tell no tales. Except Epstein got emails, that's a whole different story. Right? So dead man emails is an entire different story. Okay. Be careful about your Gmails, guys. Anyway, so so that's that about search versus state. I already mentioned that if you want to make connections to graph search, progression very nicely corresponds to just graph search. Regression is already very painful to correspond to graph search, right? Because regression is actually doing parallel searches to see if any one of them reaches status. Can you think of what happens if you are trying to visualize plan space search as a graph search? Your head explodes. Right? Essentially, what you're doing is instead of constructing a path, you could be doing things like, okay, I'm going to go from S to G. Okay, I'll make sure that I'll actually, maybe I will need to, visit P. So now I need to go from S to P and P to G. And then also maybe between going from P to G, I may have to go to J. So P to J, J to G. So that path basically can be done as path planning, but essentially now you do path planning with landmarks in some weird sense. It's a very more complicated way to visualize graph search. But that also tells you that you actually have better expressive power. Because you're no longer stuck with thinking only in terms of direct paths on the graph. You're able to think in terms of a set of constraints that can be corresponding to many, many paths in the graph. Okay? So that all brings us to remember I said, I haven't got to the heuristics. The way it's going, most likely we will go to the heuristics next class, even though you read the graph plan graph, but we'll likely go next class. But I want to bring this up too, because I might actually make you read this. So one idea is, I made it sound as if progression, regression, plan space search are three different ideas. But even as I was saying, some of you recognize that progression and regression can be done together, bidirectional search. You start going this way, and then see if the fringe states, one fringe state is part of the other fringe state, you start. Can I do that with plan space also, so that I can combine plan space, progression, and regression together? So yes. All you need to do is think of a plan as a set of constraints. And in fact, plan space gives the most general constraints, which is precedence relations. Okay? To introduce regression and progression, you also need to provide contiguity constraints. Contiguity constraints are cementing actions together. So that, like they say, it's like when people are like, lovey-dovey and like so close, the sun ray can't go through them kind of a thing, that's contiguity. Right? Those are the kind of people who make you go up, right? So anyway, that's the contiguity, essentially. Right? So but A1 can be before A2, but A1 can be like next to A2. Like nothing goes through between them, nothing can possibly come between. So contiguity is a different kind of a relation than precedence relation. In general, if there's a precedence relation between two things in the plan, partial plan saying S1 comes before S2, in the final execution, you can't guess what is, all you can say is the position of S1. Final execution position of S1 will be before the final execution position of S2. But you can't say anything more. But if S1 and S2 are next to each other, then you will say final execution position of S2 will be 1 after execution position of S2. You see what I'm saying? And the contiguity constraints are useful because I would say, if you think in these terms, right, I would say that progression is essentially, this is like cemented. So progression is essentially putting what is the, so imagine in a weird situation, I'll get in a minute. Imagine a weird situation, I started with this single plan, 0 before unload A before infinity. That's just a partially ordered plan because it's a precedence relation. Normally you would do your normal plan space planning on this. But suppose I want to do progression. I can do progression. What I have to do is I take this plan and say, what can be the first action after 0? What will be the very first action of the initial state? And progression will tell you whatever are the actions whose preconditions are satisfied in the initial state can be the first action. So imagine it turns out loading A, loading B, and flying are all the possible first actions for the rocket domain. You could not put unloading A because unloading A's preconditions require A is inside. A is not inside in the initial state. This is a normal rocket problem. Everything is on the Earth. You need to load them into the rocket, take it to the moon, unload them on the moon. So the very first action can be load A, load B, or fly. So really, I take this one single partial plan and convert it into these 3 partial plans. Where these 3 partial plans, these are cemented. These are contiguity constraints. And I would argue that every solution that is present in the top is also present in one of these guys. That requires you to understand the notion of candidate set, which is the semantics of a partial plan. In the end, ultimately, for any domain, a plan is a sequence of library actions with potential repetition. Right? If you have A1, A2 as the only actions, then you can have A1, A2. You can have a null plan. You can have A1 as the plan, A2 as the plan, A1, A2 as the plan, A1, A2, A1 as the plan, A1, 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 A2 as the plan, A1, A1, A2, A2, A2 as the plan, etc. They're all plans. They're all potential plans, the candidates. The question is, these are basically, you would think of them as ground operator sequences, or ground action sequences. A plan in the end is a sequence of actions. And if the point of thinking of plans as constraints, partial plans as constraint sets, is that constraint set represents in one fell swoop potentially infinite number of ground action sequences which satisfy this constraint. Right? So the point, of course, then to do that, you basically say, if I had a plan 0 before infinity, then that plan, that partial plan can correspond to basically any arbitrary action sequence that involves loading, unloading, flying. Any arbitrary sequence. Any number of loads, any number of unloads, any number of flies, etc. I'm only saying they're consistent with the constraints. But the moment I put in unload into this, now any sequence that doesn't have at least one unload is not a candidate. Right? You don't know whether unload is the first action or the last action. But if I give you a sequence which basically says load, fly, that's it. That's the action. Or load, load, fly as the action, as the sequence. I would say those violate the constraints because you require an unload. So you can define the candidate set in terms of the constraints. You can basically look at a ground action sequence and say, would it correspond to the candidate set? And what is happening when you do this is the candidate set of that essentially will have at least one unload. The candidate set of this one must start with load A and should have at least one unload somewhere. Must start. So if it doesn't start with load A, it's not part of the candidate set. And so because these are three things together, this is like the constraint sets are disjoint. Essentially, any action sequence that's consistent with one of them is still left. So basically what is happening is you start with like a big set of action sequences. And when you do refinement, you make the set smaller and smaller. And hopefully you will get to a point where the candidates are all solutions so that you can pick one. That's the dream. But in the case of planning, unfortunately, what happens is unless you only have contiguity constraints, pretty much any plan can have infinite number of candidates. Do you guys see this? I mean, the only thing which has finite number of candidates is the one which starts with I cemented to A1, cemented to A2, cemented to A3, cemented to A4, cemented to A5, cemented to infinity. That has just one candidate. Nothing else will be satisfying. If you have even one precedence constraint somewhere in the middle, that's basically rubber band. Lots and lots of people can come inside. Right? So it becomes infinitely long. So what we actually do is we define the notion essentially of, first of all, you give a plan like this, you can talk about candidates and non-candidates. By the way, this is like, even by the standards of what I've done today's class, this is extra. It's like PhD level, if you are into this area. I will send you a paper that I wrote. It's kind of useful, but you can realize that all of these can be combined. So anyway, so given a plan like this, you can talk about what things are candidates, what things are not candidates. You can say, for example, this one is not a candidate, for example, because it violates an unsafe link constraint. Right? In addition to the constraints can essentially be ordering, contiguity, and of course, causal links. Okay, and what basically happens is that you can, since once you have precedence relations, you can have infinite number of candidates. You talk about the notion of minimal candidates. Minimal candidates are the ones that only have the actions mentioned in the constraint set, in essence, and no more actions. And they would be found for any plan, even with the precedence relations. So if it's a plan space plan, every topological sort of the plan space plan will be a minimal candidate. You can check if any one of the minimal candidates is a solution. That would be the solution check. So you could think of refinement planning as starting essentially this picture, except you are starting with a big set of candidates and changing the constraint set until the minimal candidates of the current constraint set, one of them at least corresponds to a solution. If you do this, it's beautiful in a theoretical sense. You can do, for example, some progression, some plan space, some regression, followed by some regression, some plan space, some progression, and finally reach the solution. And if I'm particularly looking smart, it's because it's a paper I wrote. Right? Because this is a paper that I will send you. In fact, back in '96, I gave an invited talk at AAI about this stuff, and then I wrote that in the AI magazine. There are also actual papers written. This one is a tutorial that I will send it to you. Refinement planning as a unifying framework for planning. And I can spend a lot of time describing this stuff, but I'm just giving you the reason to think about it is essentially you can consider plan space, progression, and regression as you can choose. You don't have to always pick. If you only pick progression, you get progression plan. If you only pick regression, you get regression plan. If you only pick plan space, you will get plan space. If you pick an arbitrary combination, you can still have a well-defined plan. And the point is, they're all refinements in the sense they're essentially adding constraints. And when you add a constraint, one thing that you will do is when you add a constraint, something that's not in the bag cannot enter the bag. When you add a constraint, some of the things in the bag get removed. Do you see what I'm saying? Yes.
But can't we use like regression and progression both can we use both regression and progression in like when we are doing this refinement planning?
All I'm saying is refinement planning is just a way of thinking how to combine progression, regression, and plan space together.
Okay.
You already know, I mean, even before I came here, you guys already knew that regression and progression can be combined because you think in terms of graph search. If you're going from S to G, you can either start searching from S towards G or start searching from G towards S.
Yes.
This is what I'm saying. That's just bidirectional search, that's regression search. Modulo the point that actually true regression might only give you partial set of goals, and you have to then, that might correspond to many complete goal states, and you have to do parallel searches from many goal states towards the initial state. I've already said that. The thing that wasn't at all obvious to you is plan space planning look, it may not have been obvious unless you guys already are much smarter. Suddenly it wasn't obvious when I wrote this paper to the rest of the community, is that plan space planning can be combined to regression and progression. This is what I'm saying. And this kind of gives like, at least theoretically, it's one of these ideas that's a nice thing. We couldn't write any planner that is more efficient than the existing planners. That's a sad story. But it gives a way of combining things. At the thought experiment level, these are just multiple complete refinements. And you can talk about what makes a refinement good versus bad. They have to be complete, in the sense they should never lose a solution. If you lose solution, it's okay to lose candidates, but if you lose solutions that are candidates, candidates that are solutions, then you lose completeness for that. So that is why this picture is important. All solutions, this is always going towards the all solutions, except it doesn't really go to the all solutions. I wish I had that picture. I don't have the picture here. Okay, I don't have that picture here, but I wish I had it. It says basically you have to think of candidate set is top lined by the minimal candidates. For each minimal candidate, you can extend it oftentimes into infinite number of the rest of the candidates. And if any of the minimal candidates is already a solution, then you're done. And this is just to say that we can put all of them together. Okay. So, and there's a bunch of stuff you can say, but I'm not going to do that. I mean, I'll send you that paper if you're interested, you can look at it. You can think of it in terms of like, what's the advantage of one type of refinement over other. Okay. So yeah, basically going from all sequence of solutions. And then I think that there's a missing thing, but basically the minimal candidates is what you're checking at any given point of time. And if any one of the minimal candidates is a solution, you can, and that would be a sound algorithm, and sound and complete algorithm. Okay. And then that paper I'll send you, you can look at it. And so the advantage is you can talk about head fringe. So if you are extending the head, so there's already a head, there is a tail. And there is a middle in the partial plan. And if you want to extend the head, you have to take something from the head fringe or from outside and put it to extend the head. Similarly, if you want to extend the tail, you take from the tail fringe or from outside and put it into the plan. If you're doing plan space search, you will just, change the middle. Okay. Okay, so in the next 15 minutes, I will start towards the heuristics discussion. And then next class, we'll do more. Okay, so this is all about search. And again, in a sense, at one point of time, heuristics were like the most important thing because there was no other way of doing planning. People were actually thinking, we will actually systematically write an algorithm that does search and then produces the plan, the more efficient the better. Nowadays, you say, who cares about efficiency? Ask ChatGPT, I will take its time and will give me. That's a different story. So that's why I will talk about the ChatGPT use too, but it's worth understanding what makes things hard for you in terms of search, right? So basically, that was the tutorial that we sent you. But in general, essentially, it's worth understanding that complexity of strips planning is p-space complete. Because one way of thinking about it is Tower of Hanoi can be written as a strips planning. And for the Tower of Hanoi, the solution itself is exponential in the size of the input specification. So it's not in the class NP because class NP requires the solution to be checked polynomial. And if the solution is actually exponentially long in the initial specification, then you can't check it in polynomial. So that is one way of showing that, general strips planning is not NP hard. It's not in the class NP. So it's above NP hard. And p-space complete is normally considered above NP hard. Okay. And of course, you can say there are subclass of planning problems, which basically where, the plan cannot be longer than, the plan size is always polynomial in the size of the initial specification, which is many, many problems. For which actually it's in the class NP. And in particular, if you are considering a variation of planning problem, where you say, can you see if there is a plan of length k for my problem? It's suggesting, can you see if there is a plan? If you say, is there a plan of length k for my problem? All of a sudden, it's no longer, you don't need to worry. You only see up to length k. So that again gets into MP's class. That's called bounded length planning. Okay, so that's the thing to understand that, strips planning normally is actually p-space complete, but, for bounded length, etc., it's class of NP hard. Okay, now, what makes planning hard? And again, this should not be surprising because I kind of hinted it before. What makes planning hard in general is sub-goal interaction. By now, you know that you give the planning at least in this kind of classical planning, the goals are given as G1, G2, Gn to be satisfied. The best possibility is for every plan, for every G1, there is a plan. And any arbitrary plan for G1 can be combined with any arbitrary plan for G2, can be combined with any arbitrary plan for G3, at which point it will be a plan for all G1, G2, Gn. That would be the happiest planning problem. Those are called independent sub-goal planning problems. If every goal you have in your life is independent of every other goal, your life is easy. The reason planning is hard is because you are just yourself, one person, who has to do all these goals. You are the bottleneck. Do you see what I'm saying? Because you need a bottleneck, a lot of things that you have to do in your life basically get dependent on each other. Right? You can't both be in the class and see Winter Olympics opening ceremonies. Both are great goals. Do you see what I'm saying? And you made the right choice, but honestly, who is to say? Right? So the point, of course, is goals will have interactions. And so you may not actually sometimes, so one way of thinking about it is, imagine I have sub-goals G1 to Gn. And suppose the plans for G1 to Gn, I have plans P1 to Pn, corresponding to G1 to Gn. And if they are independent, then essentially I can combine them in any which order and it will be a plan for all the groups. Independent actually means there is not even positive interactions. There are no interactions. So in the case of independent, then my question would be, if I have L1 is the length of the plan for achieving G1, L2 is the length of the plan for achieving G2, and Ln is the length of the plan for achieving Gn. And let's assume L1 dot n is the plan, the eventual plan for achieving G1 all the way to Gn. That's the length. In the case of search, the length of the branch is basically that, is what you're essentially, in terms of A star search, etc., you kind of estimating the length of the branch, right? And so one of the questions is, how is L1 dot n related to L1 to Ln? In the case of independent subgroups, L1 dot n is exactly equal to L1 plus L2 plus etc. Ln. If they have positive interactions, that means doing G1 makes you also do G2 on the side. Or doing G1 makes you get partial progress towards G2. Then if you're doing G1 and G2, then essentially you can have a plan that's smaller. Remember that story that essentially about, first of all, the story about that I heard essentially is that, it's a made up story. Newton essentially is, asked somebody to make like a, not in addition to the normal, normal door, he wanted a small door for a dog and a even smaller door for a cat. That's kind of unnecessary. That unless, I understand, cats are like hard to please. But honestly, if you just tell the cat, go through the dog's door, it will do. You just need one hole in the door. You don't need two holes. Right? If you basically need both of them to get in, just one hole would be enough. And so it's like a cheaper plan, honestly. You see what I'm saying? Okay. And then lots and lots of things. So for example, I want to go, I want to buy like a Arizona knickknack, to give to my friend when I reach him in some city I'm going to. But to reach him, I have to go to the airport anyway. So there are like two plans. One is to go to the airport, other is to get the Arizona knickknack. But actually, if I need both of them, I can just go to the airport, buy the knickknack, get onto the plane and go. Of course, they'll charge you an arm and a leg because you're buying the knickknack in the airport, right? But essentially, you have reduced one extra step. Those are called positive interactions. If there are positive interactions, L1 dot n, if there is no other interactions other than positive interactions, then the plan for generating achieving all the goals would actually be cheaper than the sum of the plans for generating each goal. If it is negative, it is only purely negative interactions, it will be greater. How much greater? First of all, how much smaller? This is interesting. This is L1 to N less than, it will be less than L1 to Ln, right? What is the lowest it can be?
It's the minimum of all the action.
Not that. How do you say that in mathematical notation? Max. Right? Essentially, L1 to Ln is at the minimum max of the L1 to Ln. You need to do one of them. Just because there are extra goals doesn't mean you don't need to achieve any other goals. So in the purest positive interaction case, the length of the plan for achieving all goals will be the max of the length of plans for achieving any of the goals. Lovely. That's called the max heuristic, quote unquote. Okay. If it is negative interactions alone, then it is greater than L1 plus L2 plus etc. Ln. How much greater?
Minimum of all the actions.
What?
Minimum of all the actions.
Minimum of all the actual meaning what?
Like minimum.
No, these are I'm sorry, you're asleep. Because minimum of actions in the plans will be smaller than the maximum of actions in the plans. So it has to be bigger somehow. So the question is, you found this is not just less than this, it's actually less than max of L1 to Ln. It's less than max of L1. It's basically the lowest it can be is it's less than or equal to I'm sorry, how do I say this? So it's max of L1 to Ln. So the way to write it would be that this. Max of L1 to Ln is less than or equal to L1 dot n is less than or equal to L1 plus L2 plus etc. Ln. Would you agree? That's the lowest it can get. That's my point. It'll always be less than L1 plus L2 plus etc. Ln. But the lowest it can ever get is the max of one. Max of Ln. Right? So the question, the other case is now you know that L1 in the case of in the case of negative interactions, L1 dot n is such that it would be L1 plus L2 etc. plus Ln is already less than or equal to this. The question is, what is on this side? Infinity. Why would infinity happen?
Because they keep undoing each other.
Not just that, the simplest would be, I want to do a couple of things. The simplest would be you want to achieve, let me show you a Dilbert cartoon. It'll be a while, but I'll get there. Yeah, there you go. That's the Dilbert cartoon. I just made it for this. Read this cartoon. Okay. So Alice, our records show that you haven't taken a vacation all this year. Company policy requires you to use your vacation days. Then Alice says, how you told me to work 7 days a week to prepare the project for your boss's year-end review. Do you want me to meet the artificial project target or the artificial vacation target? Right? Hello, these are mutually exclusive goals. If they're mutually exclusive, there is no plan to satisfy them. Life is like that. You wanted to see the Winter Olympics, and you also wanted to reach the class. Mostly they're mutually exclusive for maybe one or for a few who actually have a small window of Winter Olympics on your laptop and looking at them. Then you might have found a way of combining both. Otherwise, they're mutually exclusive goals. For mutually exclusive goals, the cost of the plan for achieving both is infinity. The simplest mutually exclusive goal is A and not A. But mutual exclusion can also happen because of the reachability. It's not that A or not A can never be achieved by any agent, even the infinitely powerful agent. Reachability constraints might say that, for example, like remember the not clear B and holding A, that was not, it was a mutually exclusive subcourse. That means there is no actual plan for it. You see what I'm saying? And so essentially, when that happens, let's say, when that happens, when that happens, basically you have this, you have mutually exclusive goals, and you have to figure out during the planning whether the goals have negative interactions that actually make it in such a way that, just give me a second. Make in such a way that L1 to Ln is actually much higher than, it's actually only less than infinity. It's lower bounded by L1 plus Ln. The more general case is you have both positive and negative interactions. There's some positive interactions, some negative interactions. So basically L1 dot Ln is essentially like much harder to just pin down. And heuristics are trying to give you some kind of a lower bound. And the way you will, yes, go ahead.
I was just wondering, like, we talked about how, like, if there was n variables, so that through the power of n many states, and then there's through the power of n many something.
Not something, the belief states. Yeah.
Belief states. Is there no relevance to that and the infinity here? Like,
no, the infinity here is something different. The infinity here essentially says that you can achieve G1, you can achieve G2, but you can't achieve G1 and G2. you can achieve the goal of coming to this class, you can achieve the goal of watching the Winter Olympics, opening ceremony. There is no way of achieving both at the same time. I mean, life,
Oh, it's not about the time it takes to find.
there is no plan at all.
It's just like how
Length of the plan.
Oh,
I mean, the time is connected, but the length is actually the length of the plan, and that's how long the path is. And so what we wound up doing, and you get to go up after this, what you wind up doing in the plan space planning, let me show you that picture and then I'll come back and talk about that. In terms of plan space planning, what you will try to do is one way of getting a good heuristic is basically in the progression search, essentially, you have started from a state and you have a fringe of current states, and you want to see which is closer to the initial state, which is closer to the goal state. That is the heuristic. To get that heuristic, one way you can do it is you call the planner on each of them, find the minimal cost plan, use that as a heuristic. That's perfect heuristic. But also dumb heuristic, because you have solved much bigger problem to solve a smaller problem. Right? So, in fact, that idea essentially is, imagine you are in a state P and you're trying to see how far it is from the goal state. Then what I can do is I can consider essentially doing the progression tree, right, until I reach the goal state. And then I know the length. What is the length of the path to the goal state? If you do it this way, it will work, but it's a dumb idea, computationally speaking, because you solve bigger problem to solve a smaller problem. What planning graph does is try to consider this tree and first say, consider a variation of this tree where, think of these as states or membranes, and then you remove the membrane. Then it's no longer state. This is more like what you are hoping for. These are proposition lists. And these are union of the valuations of propositions in the different states. And so then basically, if I do this first, then I can essentially say proposition list, first proposition list is P. Second proposition list is PQRS, because those are only things in these four. Third proposition list is PQRST. And then essentially, the actions that I have there, I'll put the actions here. This is called the planning graph. The advantage of this planning graph is the following. If in the planning graph, you're looking for, let's say, goal J. There is no J here, there is no J here. That tells you there is no plan of length 2 that achieves J, for sure. But if you are looking for a goal J and it is present, let's say here, that only means that it's at least length 2. It's not that for sure it's a plan. Because what is happening is we are ignoring the interactions. It's possible that J here required S and R as preconditions. S is true only in this state, R is true only in this state, and you're only in one of those states. So you wound up putting the J here, but it really could have been put there because essentially it's either this state or that. So the point is, planning graph can be thought of as an approximate reachability computation. If it says it can't be reached, it is sure. If it says it can be, if it says it can't be reached in K levels, you can take it to the bank. If it says it can be reached in K levels, that's not guaranteed. Because there may not be any plan. Because it's making approximation. So planning graph heuristics essentially try to generate this planning graph and then use it to count off the size of the plan for achieving any particular goal, starting from the initial state. That's what you read. If you read the planning graph heuristic tutorial paper, that's what you read. The one question, of course, is the way I wrote it, it looks like you first develop this, then basically convert it into this. That's crazier than the first idea. Right? Because there you did the entire projection tree, then you are combining it into this. Instead, what you have to do is you have to actually generate it directly, because if you did this and then this, then generating this will be exponentially hard. Instead, you will just directly generate this. When you directly generate this, you will start having, the thing that I said about J actually being present will happen. Because even though R and S are not in the same state, they are in the same proposition list. So an action which requires R and S and gives J will actually be used in this action list and puts J there. So when you directly compute the planning graph, it winds up being actually even an upper bound on this, a loose upper bound on this. But then it can be computed in polynomial time. And then you can use that to actually do heuristic calculation. It actually is the case that the original idea for planning graph is do like this. And when you reach a place where, let's say you are looking for G1, G2, G3, you go up until the place where G1, G2, G3 are present. At that point, there is potentially a plan, but you need to extract it. So imagine, you are looking for a place where you have R and S and T are your goals. You will come up to this place, looks like RST is possible here. So now I need to extract the plan. So then I need to do a backward search saying, okay, what actually is supporting R, what actually is supporting S, what actually is supporting T, and what are the preconditions for them, and what are the actions the previous level, etc. That is called plan extraction process. And sometimes the extraction fails. Then you go forward again. And one of the interesting things about this kind of a structure that you will see when you're reading the paper is there is persistence. It's like tenure system. Once P is present, P will always be present. That's the no-ops. That's your question. The no-op is if you don't do anything, because of the way you're saying, one of the things you can do in the general projection is not doing anything. If you not do anything, then you'll get the same state. And if you throw that into that tree, then basically anything that's present here will always be present here. And in the planning graph structure, you do it by these persistence links. Right? So if R and S and T are present here once, they will again be present here. They will again be present here. And so if you can't get a plan here, maybe you can get a plan from here. Maybe you can get a plan from here. This is the original idea of planning graph. It's called a graph plan algorithm that basically came up with this idea of generating plans. This guy called Arvin Blum, who is just like McAllister, is a stranger to planning. He's a theoretician. He came up, basically, he was trying to do planning as a max flow problem. It turns out, max flow is actually a polynomial time problem. But, it becomes harder for planning because it's unlike max flow. It's like the idea of the metaphor is preconditions are the flow and then the effects are the flow coming out of the action. But there's a nonlinearity because until all preconditions are flowing, effects won't flow. That makes it a it's not a standard max flow problem. So he generated this approach for what's called graph plan algorithm. What we will basically do this essentially is we'll actually use these same ideas, but not for generating plans, but for generating heuristics. And the reason I'm saying this to end it is because back in 2000, this thing actually came in 1995, and we in this group, in my group at that time, we basically started looking at them as a basis for heuristics. And by the time Russell and Narvik wrote their textbook, they essentially used planning graph as a basis for heuristics rather than planning graph for doing planning. And so that's basically, I think somewhere there says that it was the stuff that I did in 471 class wound up being part of. We'll talk about this when we come. I did take attendance, so any of you were not there when I was taking the attendance, the lecture that I think what's your name?
It's not about that sentence, but I was curious about.
Okay, this you are Sania?
Saida.
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 I don't know, Saida.
It's the last name, but.
Mala is the last name. No, it's not Mala, is not the last name. What's your last name? Saida. S-A-I-D.
Samad, the last.
Samad. Z. Okay, no wonder you don't have a picture at all here. So no wonder I think I already took your note. But anyway, anybody who needs to give attendance, what is your name?
George Joby.
George Zobi,
Jobi.
Jobi. Okay, okay, fine. Anybody else who needs attendance, then I'll take the question. What I took yours, I think. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Rhythm.
What?
Rhythm.
RY.
RHYTH.
RH. That's the last name?
Arya. ARY.
No, please tell me the last name. ARY. Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. Tanya Mala. Okay. Thanks. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. What's your question?
I think if we can extend the
Oh, sure.
coverage.
Why?
I feel like it's like only a couple of things.
I'm very good.
Stuff to do.
That's a different story. I mean, I'll think about it, but I mean, if it does, I get extended to everybody.
Yeah. well,
Okay,
that's
if
what-
I do that.
that's what-
I don't know. What I'm saying, if I do it, I'll do it to everybody, but I'll let you know. But I'll also probably provide a different way, which is everybody gets some number of extension days they can use. So that might happen. Okay, okay. Yes.
I had a.
Okay, 1 second. Let me just stop this.
Yeah.